Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will try and avoid being the specious orator that is displayed in the corner here, and try and give you some substance about the religion and politics in our time. You are indeed comrades in the struggle for the liberty and prosperity of our dearest of nations. I have sojourned on the continent for the last 10 years, in that very heart of darkness which goes by the name of Brussels, where daily they scheme for the destruction of our liberties and our business. Arch conspirators among them, the French, who live with perpetual anger in their breasts against all things Anglo-Saxon, not least our economics, thereby blinding themselves to their own chronic spiritual and economic decay, to which I can only echo the words of the Duke of Wellington. We always have been, we are, and I hope that we always shall be, detested in France. They pride themselves on civilization, but it is now but so much chaff blowing in the wind of globalization. France, the eldest daughter of the Church, whose finest flower, St. Joan of Arc, was herself, unfortunately, an enemy of the English, is now the most decadent of all the devastated vineyards of the modern European Church. But more immediately, their economy, and that of Italy, is about to bring down the European roof, crashing down on us all. We do not have until 2017 to get sufficient distance from this impending catastrophe not to suffer our own grave economic and social consequences, but more of Cameron and his Conservatives later, and his conservatism, should I say. The French Revolution was and remains the source of many contemporary evils, with its corrupt and corrupting principles of liberty, equality and fraternity. I was once accused in the press of rejecting the principles of the French Revolution, and I surprised my accuser by confessing immediately that I did with my whole heart and soul. Politically incorrect, maybe unapologetic always. In a previous speech to this most esteemed of all political groups, I said the revolution supplies us but the liberty of dogs, the equality of sheep, and the fraternity of wolves. The dogs of liberty attempt to herd the sheep, but the wolves of revolution consume them. The revolution, in the name of a perverted humanism, even committed that most odious sin of regicide. For he that will kill the monarch would think nothing of joining in the mob screaming for the death of the King of Kings on Good Friday. I suggested that these so-called principles, better to say perversions of the human spirit, should be replaced by human liberty in the profound and Christian sense of the word, found first in St. Augustine, no false libertarianism, together with identity and dignity. Identity, so that not just we as individuals, but also our nations rediscover who they are, lest we be assimilated into a European melting pot. Death is to be preferred to assimilation, for assimilation is a living death of the human spirit. Dignity, of the use of reason and an eternal destiny that distinguishes from the animals, and which should be protected from the very moment of conception to the very end of life, when God calls us to our reward at a time not of our choosing but his. The right to life and the right to property, both held in contempt by the blood-soaked greedy revolution, are interchangeable. Sadly, an Englishman, William Wordsworth, paid homage in 1798 to the French Revolution. Bliss was it, that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meagre, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance, when reason seemed to assert her rights, when most intent of making herself a prime enchantress. 'Tis not just irrational love of the allegedly reasonable that is enchanting, but the very modern itself. The seductress par excellence, all other loves and fidelities forgotten, in the very moment of rapture, shock and perversion. So I now make no apologies for first speaking about the modern in religion before I move on to the modern in politics. As the Duke of Wellington said, educate people without religion and you make them but clever devils. The Catholic Church, to which I belong, has suffered under the very heavy burden of the modern for the last 50 years. I, for one, am not celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council, rather the much more important 1700th anniversary of the victory of Constantine at the Milvian Bridge, with the important consequence of the acceptance of the Christian religion in Rome and in the Empire. We shall not conquer by being open to the world and its ways, but in close array around the sign of the cross, Salve crux spes unica, in hoc signo vinces. In this sign we will conquer. And one of the signs of the acceptance of Christianity was the outlawing of homosexual unions. At the Second Vatican Council there was a great movement back to the Fathers to allegedly rediscover the pristine freshness in faith of the early church at the time of Constantine. But the modern world is pushing us further back into the past, into a new paganism. As I said in a letter to the Times when Rowan Williams became an archdruid, when Pope St. Gregory the Great, Apostle of the English, told St. Augustine of Canterbury to transform rather than destroy pagan altars, he could not have expected Augustine's successor to reverse the process. What Williams did for religion, Cameron now does for morals with his proposals for gay marriage.
Yeah.
The remoralization of our society needs leadership, not followership of all modern trends, as Cameron is so adept at doing. Cameron saying that he will fight secularism is like a European politician saying that he will fight corruption, or Berlusconi saying that he is off women. The task is made easier for the new pagans, not just by the simple trahison des clercs, the betrayal by the clergy, but by the abandonment of the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas by the modern church. Indeed, in the encyclical Aeterni Patris, which established Thomism as the philosophy of choice, at least for Catholics, Pope Leo XIII presciently stated that even critics of the Church openly declare that if the teaching of Thomas Aquinas were only taken away, they could easily battle with all Catholic leaders. And just to explain this, I am obliged to quote at length the encyclical Studiorum Ducem of Pope Pius XI. Sorry, it's a long quote, but a glorious one. Again, if we are to avoid the errors which are the source and fountainhead of all miseries of our time, the teaching of Aquinas must be adhered to more religiously than ever. For Thomas refutes the theories propounded by modernists in every sphere. In philosophy, by protecting the force and power of the human mind and by demonstrating the existence of God by the most cogent arguments. In theology, by distinguishing the supernatural from the natural order and explaining the reasons for belief and the dogmas themselves. In theology, by showing that the articles of faith are not based upon mere opinion but upon truth, and therefore cannot possibly change. in exegesis by transmitting the true conception of divine inspiration, in the science of morals, in sociology and law, by laying down sound principles of legal, social, commutative and distributive justice, explaining the relations between justice and charity. Last, against the much vaunted liberty of the human reason and its independence in regard to God, he asserts the rights of primary truth and the authority over us of the Supreme Master. It is therefore clear why modernists are so amply justified in fearing no doctor of the Church more than St. Thomas Aquinas." End quote. So it is very clear why I like St. Thomas so very much. Go to Thomas, to divine Thomas. There was a great sign of hope that the long post-conciliar devastation of God's vineyards was coming to an end with the elevation of Pope Benedict to the papal throne. He understood the nature of the office more than any other modern, that while the bishops participate in the teaching office, the papacy cannot be rented out to them in the name of collegiality. At the council, Cardinal Ottiavani, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, was asked to come up with an example of collegiality from the early church, to which he responded, "The only one that I can find is when all the apostles ran away." It is of vital significance. My one criticism of Benedict is that he laid aside the time-honoured title of the Patriarch of the West, for which he even received the much more important criticism than mine from the Moscow Patriarchate, to whom infallibility, not jurisdiction in the West, is the real problem. It is of vital significance as the only ecumenism today of real interest is between traditionally minded groups, Orthodox, Anglicans and Catholics, since most Anglicans and alas many Protestants are suffocating their faith in a woman ordaining progressivism. A desperate search for love celebrated in dogma-free zones whose only object is to please crowds but whose churches are emptier day by day. The Anglicans talk many pretty words about ecumenism, but their ordination of women shows that they are not serious. Pope Benedict talked in the 2005 speech to the Curia about the hermeneutic of continuity, saying that there was no real change at the Second Vatican Council. This was the leitmotif of his papacy. If this was the case, what on earth was the purpose of the Second Vatican Council? Councils are normally called as a result of grave crises in the life of the Church. But in 1960, mass attendance was growing strongly and more Catholics than ever understood the meaning and practice of their faith. The freefall set in after the Council. Now there really is a crisis, but God forbid that Pope Francis call a Third Vatican Council to finish the unfinished work of the modernists at the Second. Bliss was it that dawned to be alive, indeed, at the Church's very own French Revolution. Ratzinger, a progressive of the very highest order at the Council, in many ways became the ecclesiastical Napoleon. Napoleon who tried to reconcile conservatives with the principles of the Revolution, symbolised by Napoleon's imperial coronation on this very day in 1804. Oh, that the Pope again would be again crowned and not inaugurated as all have been since Paul VI. For reading the augurs is nothing if not pagan. Indeed, Catholicism prospered in France when there was no other monarch to turn to after 1870. But it was the radical revolutionary Ratzinger, not words that you normally associate with Ratzinger, who broke the power of the Roman Curia at the Council in a speech he drafted as a theological advisor to the near-blind Cardinal Frings. Without this speech, there would have been no declaration on religious liberty, but one on religious tolerance. And Western society as a whole would be on much firmer grounds, confident in its own identity. Dialogue would not have become another word for surrender. The Council talked very loud about human conscience. For, of course, did not Cardinal Newman say, conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ, a prophet in its informations, a monarch in its preemptiveness, a priest in its blessings and anathemas. And further, Cardinal Newman said, certainly if I am obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still, to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards. But the conciliar conscience is conscience not divine, but of readers of the tablet, unaligned and forgetful of its twin prudence. No wonder the virtue of obedience was forgotten after the council. Any act of disobedience was inspired by some alleged spirit of Vatican II. And in the bitterest of ironies, traditionalists had to become disobedient to the modern church in order to preserve the faith. The council can be seen on the surface as a continuity, not least because the real breaks came before the council, first philosophical and then theological. The first philosophical break came with the acceptance of Maurice Blondel's fatal definition of truth, after which anything becomes possible. He wrote, in place of the abstract and chimerical definition of truth as the adequation of intellect and reality, we must substitute research and define truth as follows: the adequation of intellect and life. After that definition, anything became possible, and the great Thomist Father Gary Gillibrand wrote to Blondel, warning him of just how long he was going to spend in purgatory because of these beliefs. The second philosophical break was the attempt to reconcile personalist and traditional philosophy as an alternative to natural law philosophy. The modern church has ended up teaching morals as if a breach will damage the person, but this in conscience is rejected. A personalist argument against homosexuality is no argument at all. Rather, they should follow the natural law which Edmund Burke called the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher natures, connecting the visible and the invisible world. The final philosophical break was the submission of Father Marichal, a really obscure Belgian Jesuit, but very important one, to the Kantian critique of the possibility of metaphysics, which unnecessarily emasculated much Thomistic theology. He did this in Cahier 5 of Le Point de Départ de la Métaphysique. The Church had surrendered ground to the unemotional mathematical explanations of Hawking and the cold, unfeeling chemical process of Dawkins, even before either were born. And now Dawkins wants to complete the rout and prove the triumph of science and the non-existence of God. I for one will never bend the knee to nature without grace. Theologically, the break came later with the publication of de Lubac's Surnaturel in 1948, in which he postulated that grace and nature had become compartmentalized when in reality they should have been joined. The end effect was to deny the sheer gratuitousness of God's grace and to leave the way open for the father of all modern heretics, Karl Rahner. When everything is full of grace, anything can be accepted, and we return to Blondel's definition of truth. So there was at least a chance under Pope Benedict that traditionalists could be reconciled to the Church. Failure to achieve this has been catastrophic both for the Church and for traditionalists. A fatal error was made in the foregoing papacy by making the texts of Vatican II a litmus test of orthodoxy, ignoring all other previous councils. The real debate should have been about the breaks described above, not Vatican II itself. Vatican II is only a symptom of taking false philosophical and theological paths. The use of Vatican II texts has been promoted by Archbishop Muller, the new head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who, horrible to say, is a defender of liberation theology, which did so much damage to the South American Church in the 1970s, and whose fellow travellers would have left us enslaved under the communist yoke. I am not too young to have been a Cold War warrior, but one thing I do know is that Lech Walensa's pleas would have fallen on deaf ears in the modern Vatican. My spirits have hardly been raised by the election of the new Pope, whose record of suppressing the Latin Mass in his own archdiocese is lamentable, and has the excessively strange opinion that the Falkland Islands are Argentinian. Too many British soldiers sacrificed their lives in the defence of the sovereignty of the islands for this to be even remotely true. Does he want to invite the Italian army to take Rome again, as they did in 1870, and make him a prisoner in the Vatican? The Pope of the time had been dependent on the French garrison, which promptly withdrew. Never rely on the French to defend anything, least of all the papacy. I always thought that once we had a Pope who had not been at the Council, some progress could have been made in the restoration of tradition to her proper place alongside the Scripture and Magisterium in the Church. But there is only one group of people who are keener on the Vatican Council than the Council Fathers themselves. Those who were at seminaries in the 1960s, before the great emptying of the seminaries, as was Jorge Bergoglio. It was indeed bliss, it was that dawn to be alive. For Monsignor Ronnie Knox, convert from Anglicanism and sometime Catholic chaplain at Oxford, said, "He who travels in the bark of Peter had better not look too closely into the engine room." Pope Benedict was all too well acquainted with the engine room. Pope Francis, by contrast, sees no problem with the post-conciliar times, and indeed calls the Second Vatican Council a beautiful work of the Holy Spirit. It is as much ruled by the Holy Spirit as the Falklands is ruled by Buenos Aires. One can only fear what could happen now, given the Pope's support of the charismatic movement. The Holy Spirit can be used, or even the Spirit of Vatican II can be used to justify precisely anything. Bliss it was that dawn to be alive. I just hope that we do not see a repeat of Pope John the 23rd. Neoconservatives at the time said, "Don't you worry, that could never happen." But that happened over and over and over again. Finally, we must await the next generation for a Pope who sees the Council for the disaster it was, resulting in empty echoing churches, often bulldozed away, and a faith not passed on to children. In Vienna, they even have a ghastly cube called the Vatican II Memorial Church. If you seek its monument, look around. Unfaithful clerics and empty churches, and a faith not taught. And its pseudo-spirit even pervaded the Anglican Church, whose radicals were freed to even greater radicalism when the Roman anchor gave way. There is a Viennese saying, there are three great mysteries of the Church. How many women's orders actually exist? Where the wealth of the Franciscans comes from, and what a Jesuit really believes. And reading Pope Francis, his life in his own words, one is tempted at least to agree with the last. We have waited centuries for a Jesuit Pope, and he disguises himself as a Franciscan. The 5 Jesuits in my family will be turning in their grave to see the modern version of the order. The revival of traditional ceremonial begun under Pope Benedict is at an end in the name of Franciscan simplicity. There is an enormous danger that this Franciscan simplicity is not a love of the poor, but an ostentatious display of poverty. Dominicans are a mendicant order, but simply do not make the same song and dance about it as the Franciscans. Love of poverty becomes a pauperism to please the modern world, not least as it stands as a concession to the worldly who attack the church for her wealth. Ironic, by the way, that the poorest church I ever did see in Austria stands surrounded by millionaires' villas, many of whom go out of their way to loudly criticise the church for her wealth. The conscience of the rich, as C.P. Snow entitled one of his novels. I am all in favour of restoring the church, as St. Francis was told to do by God at San Damiano, and whose example Pope Francis hopes to imitate. However, this will not be achieved by the Pope if, instead of promoting religion, imposes his ideas of poverty on us all. He should resolve the crisis in his own church before making pronouncements as he did today about the economic crisis, which is making a very good job of imposing universal poverty on all of its own. Pope Francis seized the highest office with a short but evocative speech at the pre-conclave meetings. He complained about theological narcissism, but after the council the church was never more self-referential. What can be more self-referential than the modern Mass, where the priest faces the people and the faithful are no longer the body of Christ but a pilgrim people of God wandering over the face of the earth? He wants the church to go out to evangelise, but ironically all over Europe there are mission crosses set up in churches to which the date of each local mission is added. Normally these happened every 10 years in the past, but they stop in the 1950s. Where did it all go wrong? Before anything, the church must turn to the East in prayer, priest and people open to the divine. But now I turn from Rome to English politics. May God deliver us from the complacent romanticism of Alfred Lord Tennyson in Mordartha. The old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. Arthur, the second finest name that a Briton can possess after George, St. George being our principal patron, along with St. Alban in heaven. David is good for a Welshman. David Lloyd George seems to have prospered for a while under his patronage, as well as having a fair amount of the natural genius of the Welsh. But now I come to Scottish Dave, Dave Cameron. Like the Pope who made a dramatic intervention in the pre-conclave meetings, Dave won election with a sharp and confident speech. Old Etonians are not known for their lack of confidence. But the battles for this country will not be won in the playing fields of Eton, or indeed by a cosy clique of Old Etonians. If, God forbid, I was Prime Minister, I could certainly find enough talent among my fellow alumni of Manchester Grammar School to run the country, after a manner. But an old Mancunians club would be a disaster for the country, as it will be entirely lacking in balance and vision, to the exclusion of other talent. And as Pope Francis is in danger of trapping the church in the infernal 1960s, Dave Cameron has trapped the Tories in the 1950s. He is the reincarnation of Harold Macmillan, not unlike Macmillan responding to events, my dear boy, events, but with no real personal vision for the country. The important difference from Macmillan is that Macmillan represented a northern seat, so understood to some degree the travails of working people. Even Macmillan was bold enough to say, with a courage of which Cameron would never be capable, it is only by giving their heads to the strong and to the able that we shall ever have the means to provide the protection for the weak and for the old. There is no dignity in poverty, whatever the Pope may say. Cameron can never win a future election without Scottish, Welsh and certainly Northern votes. And there is a complete disconnect with the party and the people. He is a barrier to the return of a Conservative Party to the plenitude of power with a real working majority in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
I waited 16 long years for the return of the Conservatives to power, and now clearly we'll be waiting for a few years yet. In Yes Minister, the final episode before it becomes Yes Prime Minister, Sir Humphrey tells Jim Hacker what is the quality that makes men, or indeed women, Prime Minister. Sir Humphrey's reply, it is the killer instinct, Minister. This frightened Jim, but the real Dave has never had the killer instinct. He is in a profound sense an accidental Prime Minister. And above all, to have made the coalition work in Conservative interests, he needed that killer instinct. In reality, the Lib Dem tail has been wagging the Conservative dog over the past years. The Lib Dems would have been crucified at any election that had been called since the last general election, but they behave as they are now masters of the House. Dave never had the will to power. Indeed, I believe he willed the result of the last election in his heart of hearts. I am all too painfully aware of that liberalising tendency on the left of the Tory party, having worked for Baroness Nicholson, Lib Dem peer and former Tory MP, who defected on New Year's Eve. I received a telephone call from my father in Austria saying, have you heard, Emma Nicholson has defected. I thought it was a New Year's joke. It was. But a grim reality. But return to power, even if it is shared, is not sufficient in itself without policy. We are not expecting the confounded systems of the Continentals. I had my fill of these systems in 10 years in Brussels. But the pragmatic pursuit of power practiced by Conservatives for generations, not least to exclude from that same power to the greatest degree possible and for the maximum amount of time Socialists and Liberals. Now that does require vision to be successfully pursued. Take, for instance, education. Where is the vision that will return one grammar school to each and every significant town in the country? Vision which will restore education in craft and enterprise in parallel and with equal dignity to intellectual excellence, not in the modern Conservative Party. That said, until his claims this week that he wished to be heir to Blair, I believe that Michael Gove was the one solitary ministerial talent of which the government could rightly boast. He had, after all, distributed King James Bibles to each and every school in the country to mark the 400th anniversary of that most excellent of books.
Yeah.
There can have been no sounder act in the whole history of British government. But to claim to be heir to Blair, when Blair and his kind have dragged the country into a postmodern ditch, the very antithesis of traditionalism for which we all stand. For Blair's vanity, the lives of British soldiers were sacrificed in foreign entanglements without clear purpose. Bliss, they said, the first day of a Labour government, it was that dawn to be alive. Indeed, they said it could only get better when we were trapped in year zero of the Blair government, which put at naught the achievements of the previous generation of Conservatives. The French Revolutionary calendar also had its year one. But now the Conservatives have had to put up with Dave and Teresa, pretending that before them the Tory party were a nasty party who were all but criminal. This is disrespect for your own people. No wonder Tory councillors are defecting to UKIP. And we had, even today, a chum of Dave Cameron saying that the Tory party was made up of mad, swivel-eyed loons. So I suggest he should go and meet a real swivel-eyed loon. That could have been Idi Amin, but sadly, I'm pleased to say that Idi Amin is now dead and unavailable. But there is still living the Iraqi information minister. He was completely off his head. There are also many people that we could research in Brussels and in the Obama administration that would make prime candidates for being swivel-eyed loons. Christian and Tory were originally epithets of abuse. UKIP now has a gadfly club after being called gadflies. So I plead guilty today. I am proud to be a swivel-eyed loon. Yeah. Why does Mr. Cameron surround himself with such people who think that can be found in the Chipping Norton Conservative Party mad, swivel-eyed loons? I frankly don't think there is any hope for the guy. It is all too late, but I will go on. Now we have to await a future where Gove is going to proclaim himself the new man. We do not need a new man. We need a Conservative man, or woman for that matter. The Conservative Party the Conservative Party was at her very best led by a woman. Mr. Cameron has so modernised the Conservative Party that it no longer lives up to its name. Mod Con is not Conservative. As Burke said of the French Revolution, our business is interrupted, our repose is troubled, our pleasures are saddened, our very studies are poisoned and perverted, and knowledge is rendered worse than ignorance by the enormous evils of this dreadful innovation. And I name this dreadful innovation rather the modernism of the Conservative Party. Dave ought to have seen what happened to the Catholic Church when it turned modernity into an idol to be venerated. Being trendy appeals to nobody, as there is always somebody more trendy than yourself. It is like organising a disco service in church to appeal to youth. There are plenty of better discos around with more alcohol at very least. The church will be saved by her traditionalists. Conservatism will be saved by the true believers in UKIP. Take also on policy military spending. It is understood that the coffers are empty, but where is the future vision of the armed forces that can enforce the will of Her Majesty's government at two places simultaneously anywhere throughout the world without the help of anybody, unless perhaps we are disputing with China or Russia, where I concede we might need some help from the Americans. We have been reduced to sharing aircraft carriers with the French. We should not be excessively keen on fighting alongside troops who might cancel an offensive for lunch. who surrender rather than having their joie de vivre shattered. Somewhere along the Maginot Line, indeed, there is a plaque dedicated to a French regiment who surrendered without having been defeated. Take also, for instance, the economy under the Dave's Conservatives. Cameron is as embarrassed by capitalism as Ted Heath was, in contrast to Enoch Powell, who said, "Whatever else the Conservative Party stands for, unless it is the party of free enterprise, of free choice, free competition and free enterprise, unless, I am not afraid of the word, it is the party of capitalism, then it has no function in the contemporary world." And I for one do not mean by capitalism the corporatism practiced by Labour and Tory governments alike, which hold the small and medium-sized enterprises that make up the vast bulk of the economy in the same contempt as they are held in Brussels. We will be waiting forever for a government which contains the anti-business secretary, Vince Cable, to transform the British economy into the dynamic engine that the country needs. Yet another deregulation initiative is fizzling out, ground down by the Sir Humphreys of this world, who have a vested interest not just in regulation, but in better regulation. Excessive taxes and regulation are the drumbeats at the funeral of a civilized society. And as I rode on my bike in snow on a cold April morning in Wales, I wondered how many businesses had been put out of business by global warming dogmatism, which may be in its last throes, as even the scientists have realised that they have not only deceived others, but deceived themselves in the pursuit of state money. A bandwagon that the unprincipled Cameron was only too happy to ride. I am all in favour, I hasten to add, of environmentalism based on science. I tested, indeed, the electronic equipment that confirmed the hole in the ozone layer all those years ago, and made speeches on the environment as a Conservative candidate even before Mrs. Thatcher. But in politics, all too often new green is but old red writ large. Like Cameron, they are not concerned with people or indeed the environment, but with personal power. Besides, how many people today are concerned about the environment the day after tomorrow, when only with the greatest difficulty does the economy not breathe her last today? The only way back is through entrepreneurship and transformative innovation. It is time that the natural genius of the British people is unleashed, instead of being shackled by Brussels and Whitehall. The only innovation I really believe in is economic. Goods and services, however, must be traditional in form and content. Modern methods of production mean that the finest can be produced, and the cheap modern no longer has an excuse. Nothing can really stop a nation that has the inventive imagination to bounce bombs over water to destroy the raw dams. Dam busters whose anniversary we celebrated 2 days ago, or drove a destroyer straight through the front door of Dieppe Harbour, or broke the Enigma codes to ensure that Europe should be free. And so take, for instance, Europe. The things that make politicians bring them down. Cameron tried to stop the Conservative Party, in his words, banging on about Europe to secure his position. It was important then, and it is even more important now, given the creeping tyranny of Brussels-directed economic governance of Europe. I do not know which Brussels Cameron visits when he goes to European Council meetings. I lived for 10 years not 200 yards from the European Council building, and after 10 years I was used to ministers proclaiming victory when they had in fact either made no difference at all or had been roundly defeated. They did not go native, they just behaved like the French.
Yeah.
I was also used to victories that should never have been in question, proclaimed as a miraculous force of arms. Cameron is like the enthusiastic young monk who thinks he is going to be the great reformer of the order which he joins. Destined he is to failure and disappointment. Not one order has been reformed from within in the entire history of the Catholic Church. There's always been splits within orders to bring about the reform. For the other Europeans, the stakes are too high to let us have our own special way. There are too many vested interests. And yes, the single market. Oh, single market, oh, single market. What crimes have been committed in your name against British business? Lord Astor says the Tory party will campaign heart and soul to stay in Europe. So great an effort will be totally in vain. I once as a student was accused by an Oxford Don of being a reed in the wind, shaken by every gust. This was a misdiagnosis of me personally, even in those days, as I do not doubt, as it is bad both for the soul and bad for the psyche. But little did I expect that we should have a leader of the Conservative Party some 30 years later, who, despite the advantages of the very best education, even going to the same university as myself, who should be a reed shaking in the wind, too busy responding to every slight whisper to be effective at governing a great nation with the vision that requires.
Yeah.
I am all for the pragmatic pursuit of power, but Dave's perpetuum mobile comes over as the personal and craven desire to retain office. It is just so transparent to voters, and they are not fooled. The truth is that he is not a true believer in anything. Unlike the bark of Peter, the good ship Cameron is eminently sinkable and should, I recommend, be put to calmer waters as a matter of urgency. May I suggest the Norfolk Broads, which are flat, before the good ship Cameron takes conservatism, and even more importantly, the country with him, shackled to an insignificant little dinghy called Lib Demery, from whose crew the Conservative captain takes all his orders. Of Mrs. Thatcher, it was said she thought the unthinkable, and thereby transformed the country. Cameron, by contrast, cannot even think the unthinkable. The country remains in the post-modern stasis established by Blair. Mrs. Thatcher spoke from the heart of England to the heart of Great Britain in language clear and conservative that moved all but the most stubborn. She proved forever that the country can be led from the right and must be led from the right, providing policy is clearly articulated. It is a lesson that Cameron and his modernising kind are determined to forget, not least because of their own personal inability to articulate policy. So to Mrs. Thatcher's eternal memory, we have to see her like again, because the nation will need such as her. Without her, Cardinal Bergoglio would have sung Te Deum every year since 1987 in Port Stanley, as he did on National Day every year in the Cathedral of Buenos Aires. I apologise, 1982. Without her, we would be ruled not by Brussels, but by Moscow's willing satrap Arthur Scargill. Without her, all hope of future and better glory of our nation would have been extinguished forever. This is the flame that we carry, and this is the flame which we carry with pride. More things are wrought by prayer than this world dreams of, says the dying Arthur in Tennyson. Pray for the soul and body of our nation, epitomised in the great King Arthur. He is part mythical figure, but he stands for something deeper and eternal in our nation. The eternal spring, ever renewing herself in the face of history. We cannot be true to ourselves and to our dearest of nations, spiritually or temporally, unless we be true to tradition and drink most deeply from that spring. Thank you very much.